Train slow. Dun, 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 dun. Ride fast. An age-old mantra that through new scientific understanding is becoming increasingly popular again, and it's now got a catchy name, Zone 2. So the theory goes, train for 80% of your time in Zone 2 and you'll become more efficient at utilising fat for energy and at higher intensities, plus you'll also be able to clear lactate faster, raise your FTP and even live longer, apparently. The reason for it is to improve your mitochondrial function. What are mitochondria? Say after me, your cell's power plants. Yes, that's right. Now, question is, what is Zone 2 though, and how do you find it? Well, in this video, I'm going to tell you. I'm also going to run through the accessible method, which requires zero tech at all. And then I'm going to do a metabolic test in a lab to accurately pinpoint what my Zone 2 is, so I can see, firstly then, whether or not I've estimated it right. And following that, can I offer you any tips on having estimated it and then found out my actual result, refining that accessible method? But what is it though? It's a good question. Zone 2 is that exercise intensity where you're burning the maximum amount of fat that you can. A lighter intensity, and you simply wouldn't have as much energy need, so you wouldn't be burning as much. And at a higher intensity, your body would have to switch into burning principally glycogen. So it's that point at which your type 1 slow twitch muscle fibers are working at their capacity. And that is the point of Zone 2 training, basically, is to stress these type 1 muscle fibers as much as possible without then recruiting those glycogen burning fast twitch fibers and having to switch into a completely different metabolic system. So how do you find your Zone 2 then? So according to Dr. Inigo San Millan, who, as well as being many things, is Tadej Pogacar's coach and has now become the kind of unofficial poster boy for Zone 2 training, he says that if you don't have access to a lab for metabolic testing or lactate testing, that you can find it with a very simple conversation test. So if you're riding along and you can have a normal conversation, then you're going too easy. What you want is to be able to have a conversation, but to it to feel a little bit forced at times. And then if you're going so hard that you can't have a conversation, well, that isn't Zone 2 either. So for me, riding along, talking to you now, I'd say I'm probably at the bottom end of Zone 2. I reckon about 250 watts at a heart rate of about 150 is my Zone 2. But a bit of a curveball, I've noticed that on the indoor trainer, if I'm sat at about 220-ish, I'm at a similar level of out of breathness, a similar level of perceived exertion. So maybe that's my range then, 220 to 250. But then there's another method, which I've read about, particularly on running blogs, and that's the nose breathing method. So if you can ride at an intensity that allows you to just breathe through your nose, so not out your mouth, then that is also about Zone 2. But you see, maybe I've just got massive nostrils, but I can definitely get another 20 watts out over the conversation method when I'm nose breathing. So I'm not entirely convinced by that one. Now, what you can't do to find Zone 2 is to use power or heart rate and try and work it out as a percentage either of your FTP or of your maximum heart rate. Because it might be that some people's Zone 2 is in a broadly similar range, not everyone's, and I'll give you a really good example why. Because the fitter you are, and the more Zone 2 training you do, the better your mitochondrial function will be. But therefore, your Zone 2 will be a higher percentage of your maximum heart rate and also will be at a higher power as well. So the more Zone 2 training you do, the higher your Zone 2 power will be and the higher your Zone 2 heart rate as well. And I think this confuses a lot of people because it might seem like someone is training too hard for Zone 2, when in actual fact, they're not. It's right for them. Now then, as I said, I think from my nose breathing and conversation experiments that my Zone 2 is about 240 to 260 watts. But now I'm actually going to find out. So I've come up to Bath University, which is GCN's local university that also happens to have awesome sports facilities and the home to a lot of high performance sports. They're going to run me through a metabolic test where they'll gradually increase the wattage I need to ride at on a static bike whilst recording a load of data, particularly expired gases. Because what we're looking for, remember, is that point at which our bodies are burning the maximum amount of fat that they can before the intensity then forces us to burn more carbohydrate and we can't sustain that fat burning any longer. Your expired gases can be collected and analysed with the ratio of carbon dioxide and oxygen indicating whether primarily fat or carbohydrate is being used for fuel. It's called the respiratory gas exchange ratio, and an RER of 0.7 would indicate you're basically not moving and you're burning primarily fat, whereas an RER of over 1 would suggest that you're primarily burning carbohydrate. So we're looking for something in the middle. We'll also collect my lactate levels from my blood using a little gizmo like this. So typically, someone in zone 2 would have lactate levels in the region of 1.7 to 1.9 millimoles, but it does vary from person to person. So a pro cyclist, for example, might have much lower lactate levels for their zone 2, even though their wattages would be high enough to make you weep. So Jonathan, what's our test protocol today? How are we going to do this?
So what we're going to do is a kind of a step test, a progressive step test. So it'll start really easy and gradually get harder in stages which are about 5 minutes long, and then we'll go up kind of 20 watts each stage. So we'll start about 160 and go 160, 180, 200 and go through like that. You'll have a face mask on, which is going to record how much air you're breathing in and out, how much oxygen you're using, how much carbon dioxide you're producing, and we'll get some data from that. And then we'll also grab lactate from a fingertip blood sample, heart rate, and kind of your perceived exertion as we go through.
And we don't actually have to go anywhere close to my max, do we? This is very much a sub-max test, right?
Yeah, so very much a sub-max test. It's only looking at what's going on in those early stages and how much oxygen you're using, and from that we can work out kind of how much fat and carbohydrate you're using.
Cool.
And kind of once you reach that fat max stage, after that, the amount of fat you're using will start to decrease, and as it gets harder, it's not going to come back again, it's not going to increase again, so we know we've got enough data from there. Cool.
So a non-painful fitness test, aside from the lactates, basically?
Yeah, pretty much.
Right then, put me out of my misery, Jonathan. What is my zone 2?
So I think from the data that we collected, obviously the lactate, the heart rate, the oxygen consumption data, and the parameters we can work out from that, we're probably looking at around maybe about 230 watts to 260.
Okay. That
sort of range, so probably about 150 beats per minute to 162.
Cool, okay. And so at what point then did my fat max occur then? Can you see that on the graph?
Yeah, so the graph's quite interesting in that to start off with, it's reasonably easy and you're using some fat, but as it gets a little bit harder, the energy you need to use to cycle at that speed or that power output jumps up.
Yeah.
And so probably from about 220 watts to 260, it's fairly steady at an elevated level.
Yeah.
And then quite clearly, once we go past 260 watts, it starts to drop off.
Yeah.
And then correspondingly, the carbohydrate consumption or usage starts to increase after that.
Yeah.
So that's probably that tipping point.
Yeah, and interestingly, when I was doing the test and you were showing me the perceived exertion score, and I pointed to 12, and you were like, yeah, okay. So why was that? What's the significance of 12?
So quite commonly on that scale we use, which runs from 6 to 20, so obviously not a 1 to 10 scale, but 6 to 20. 12 is with athletes who are used to endurance training and used to monitoring how they're feeling. 12 is quite commonly where they would kind of self prescribe that top of that zone 2.
Yeah.
So it's It's reasonably easy, but just starting to maybe get a little bit harder, and athletes can tend to find that out.
Yeah.
And I think you said as well, I can feel my breathing's changed a little bit.
Yeah.
So you probably are breathing a little bit more at that point as well.
I feel a bit teary that you're inferring that I'm still an athlete, Jonathan. Honestly, it makes me quite emotional. What about those lactates then? So that was like a kind of an additional nice to have. Did that tally up with the other data that you've measured?
So it was fairly steady in the early stages. Once you got used to riding with the mask on and the blood samples and stuff, it was fairly steady. And then we did start to see it kind of jump up 240, 260 watts. So the point after 260, it makes a clear jump.
Yeah.
And that, your lactate at that level was 1.7.
Yeah.
But when you go to 280, it's jumped to 2.4. So quite a significant jump.
Yeah. Great stuff. That has been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much
Pleasure.
for the data and the insight as well. A lot to think about there, I think. In conclusion then, it turns out you really can find your zone 2 with the conversation method. I was really quite pleased with that result, I'm not going to lie. I would say though that even though the conversation method is great for finding your zone 2, if you can train with a heart rate monitor, and even better a power meter as well, I think that'll help you maintain riding in zone 2 when you're out training. And also it gives you that extra insight so you can actually monitor your training and your progression as well. I have learnt through filming this video whilst trying to find my zone 2 that the best way, even if you're going for the conversation method, is to do a really slow, gradually progressive ramp on the bike. So find a really long flat road or a very steady climb, or even better, do it on the indoor trainer. And bear in mind as well, it's only when you settle into an intensity for 5 minutes or more that you're actually getting a feel for that particular intensity and not the one that you're riding before. Before we leave though, 2 other points about zone 2 training. When you are out on the bike doing your zone 2, just remember that you need to keep pressing on the pedals in order to stay in it. If you're freewheeling or you're riding too easy, then you're not making the most of your training time. But then even more serious than that, if you come out at the top of zone 2, if you go and smash it up a climb, bear in mind that you won't get back into the right metabolic state for 30 minutes or so. So it's really worth being controlled whilst you're out there. And the second point is keep in mind the big picture. So it's all very well focusing on zone 2 training. I think it is really beneficial, but you want to keep in mind what you actually want your goal in cycling to be, and don't neglect those higher intensities, which will be beneficial, I think, for most of us achieving our goals. Certainly for me, I've been feeling really good after doing zone 2 training, and then I went back and did a particularly grueling session up Alpe d'Huez, and I found I was not as fit as I thought I was. So beware. Right, give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and let me know how you get on finding your zone 2 in the comment section down below.